Well, good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to the Walter Soboleff building, the home of Sealaska Heritage Institute. And I'd like to welcome all the guests from near and far. This afternoon we're going to hear a lecture by Christopher Green on North by Southwest, Modernism and Nathan Jackson's early work, which will focus on Nathan's early career in the 1960s and his work in Alaska and New York and at the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe. Chris Green is a Ph.D. candidate in art history at the Graduate Center in CUNY. His research focuses on modern and contemporary Native American art, the representation and display of indigenous culture, and primitivisms of the historic and neo-avant-garde. He is currently a 2018-19 Smithsonian Institution Predoctoral Fellow at the Smithsonian American Art Museum and the NMAI. And he will be the 2019 and 20 Daedalus Foundation Dissertation Fellow in New York. Before he gets started, I'd like to announce that we will be having two more lectures this month. On July 23rd, we'll be having presentations on historical trauma that accompanies our work on epigenetics and historical trauma, the research project that's underway now with residents and descendants of Huna tribal members. Also, on July 31st, Dr. Madonna Moss will be here presenting on the cultural uses of sea otter as revealed through analysis of cut marks in archaeological collections and comparing that with modern day cut marks of how sea otters are butchered, which will be an interesting topic. Also, please make sure your cell phones are turned off so that we can record this peacefully. Afterwards, there'll be plenty of time for questions, so Chris, you are welcome to take the stage.
Well, thank you, Chuck. And thanks so much to the Sealaska Heritage Institute for hosting me today. Thank you so much to Rosita and Chuck for inviting me. And thank you, of course, to Akwan and the peoples of this land for hosting us today. I see lots of friends and colleagues in the audience who really helped me get started on some of this research. Folks like Jim Seymour, Zachary Jones, Steve Henriksen at the State Museum and Archives really got me going on some of this research a couple of years ago. And folks at the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, the staff of the Museum and Archives there, the staff of the Sheldon Museum, as well as Wooderson, all provided essential assistance in some of the material I'll be showing today. So thanks to them. And of course, thanks to who else but Nathan Jackson himself, Dorica Jackson, and Stephen Jackson, who have been invaluable and without whom this research would not be possible. In 1967, the Vancouver Art Gallery exhibition, Arts of the Raven, sought to fundamentally change the reception and understanding of Northwest Coast Indigenous visual and material culture. As curator Doris Shadbolt made clear in her catalog essay, the exhibition intended to enact a shift in the reception of Northwest Coast material culture from the category of ethnology to that of fine art. Most histories of Northwest Coast art thus acknowledge this exhibition as a turning point, especially because living artists were displayed alongside the masterpieces of the historic past. Artists such as Bill Reed, Robert Davidson, and Tony Hunt appeared in a section titled The Art of Today, demonstrating that new expressions of modern art done in traditional mediums could contribute to the ongoing vitality of the art styles. However, the only living artists included from the United States were either non-native or not of Northwest Coast native descent. While Tlingit art was well represented in the historic sections, no contemporary Tlingit or Alaska Native artist was included, a major absence that consequentially resulted in the history of modern Northwest Coast art being centered around artists living and working in Canada. That was not meant to be the case, however. In April 1967, several months before the exhibition opened, Doris Shadbolt wrote to the young Tlingit artist Nathan Jackson, Yekyadi, Ravenchild, working at the time in Haines, Alaska, in order to invite him to contribute work to the Art of Today section. A loan form, seen here, shows that Jackson sent the gallery a work described as a silver engraved piece inlaid into baleen, with a 2-inch rectangular centerpiece depicting an eagle in rectangular form. While that piece is now lost, a silver inlay pendant by Jackson made a few years later, in 1969, provides some estimation of what it may have looked like. This work by Jackson would have been a valuable contribution to the exhibition that would have filled the gap in the exhibition's Tlingit representation. Yet it was never shown. Jackson's name does not appear in the catalog list or anywhere in the exhibition checklist. It seems that the engraving never actually went on display. When asked about this incident 50 years later, Jackson confirmed that he did send the silver eagle piece to the gallery. The omission may have been unintentional. Perhaps the piece was lost in the mail or during the exhibition preparations, which seemed chaotic. But Jackson has suggested that perhaps the engraving was rejected by the organizers. Perhaps because it was not done by hand, but rather done by machine, a hand engraver or an engraving tool rather than solely by hand. Perhaps this was not traditional enough or authentic enough for the terms of the exhibition. The irony of this apparent rejection is that at this very moment, Jackson was in fact in the midst of a transition from a far more experimental, modernist, and decidedly untraditional media and series of visual styles. Today, Nathan is known as one of the preeminent living Tlingit carvers, as an artist, a dancer, and clan leader who has been devoted to creating and teaching Tlingit art for over 50 years. The many commissioned crest poles, house posts, panels, and screens that he has carved and continues to carve for museums and collectors around the world have placed him in history as perhaps the most prominent Tlingit revivalist of Tlingit carving practices and forms in Alaska. His dedication to the mastery, refinement, and education in the Tlingit style has made him a major figure in the revival of these practices. Yet undisclosed in most accounts of his career, and really in the history of modern Tlingit art, is Nathan's background in modern art and teachings from a Euro-American modernist tradition. His early artistic career was a melding of artistic influences, pedagogies, and trajectories that saw him take on Western modernist forms and techniques through self-learning, as well as several years of formalized fine arts education at the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe. His encounter with principles espoused by the likes of Lloyd Kiva-New and members of primitivist New York schools was a consequential influence on his development as an artist. Jackson's early oeuvre and his experiments in painting, printmaking, and graphic design challenged the idea, presented in exhibitions like Arts of the Raven, that Northwest Coast artists looked to the work of the past for inspiration before all else. In addition to the story of a master carver developing Tlingit forms, Jackson's early career presents a far more complex relationship between modern Northwest Coast art and the primitivisms of Euro-American artists who looked themselves to indigenous art for inspiration. The constellation of Nathan's artistic training troubles the binary of the modern and the traditional beyond their temporal frames and suggests a far more complex history than one of mere recovery or revival. Now, most accounts of Nathan's early career, including his own, emphasize his beginnings and development as a carver. He describes how as a teenager his clan relatives, like Ted Lawrence, challenged him to whittle copies of 4-inch miniature crest poles with an X-Acto knife or pocket knife, while he worked at until his uncles were satisfied. Jackson further learned to carve by watching his uncle Horace Marks carve model totem poles and masks in Haines. And though he witnessed Lawrence selling miniature poles for impressive prices, Jackson did not expect to make a living from carving and largely dropped the craft when he began service with the U.S. military in Germany from 1957 to 1959. Upon his return to Alaska, he worked in commercial fishing for several years, but in early 1962, he was hospitalized with respiratory illness after inhaling a lethal combination of paint dust and dried jellyfish powder while sanding a boat. Fearing tuberculosis, doctors sent Jackson to Mount Edgecombe in Sitka, where he spent nearly 2 months. The hospital had yellow cedar available for occupational therapy, so to fill his time, Jackson returned to carving, filling display cases with miniature poles and honing his skills to start him on the path of a master carver, items like this as seen downstairs in the exhibition. While at Mount Edgecombe, however, Jackson explored art forms far beyond whittling miniature poles. He encountered a fellow patient, the wheelchair-bound Tlingit man Arthur Codwat, who was an accomplished illustrator and inspired Jackson to try his own hand at drawing. Jackson began drawing by copying pictures he had on hand, such as photographs from newspaper clippings. One of his first paintings was this portrait of Jim Tuguk, his great-great-uncle. Using charcoal, Jackson made a copy of a black and white photograph of Tuguk from the Voice of the Brotherhood, the Alaska Native Brotherhood newsletter. Jackson then painted over the portrait in oil with these naturalistic colors. His depiction of the Tlingit elder displays a deft handling of shading and textural differentiation in the frontlet and draped nachin, or chilkat blanket, particularly considering that he was self-trained. Jackson later said that he found the painting inspiring because, quote, "it was a very good likeness." After the hospital, Jackson was released and returned to Haines and started painting more and more of these bust-length portraits, typically three-quarters or head-on depictions of Tlingit figures in ceremonial regalia. They sold extremely well to locals and tourists alike. He experimented in styles, materials, and techniques while selling them around town wherever he could, mainly in bars and at Helen's shop, the general store. His portraits are reminiscent of studio photographs of Edward Curtis and portraits of Tlingit elders sold as postcards and carte de visites for tourists. Yet, while Jackson's portraits, produced half a century later, operate in this legacy of postcard portraits and romanticized depictions, I would suggest that they deny a similar kind of consumption by outsiders because they, for the most part, do not represent specific individuals. They refuse to capture a certain kind of authentic depiction of his community that those non-native collectors might have desired. Following his time in the hospital, Jackson joined the Chilkat Dancers, a Haines-based dance troupe dedicated to cultural revitalization, founded by the German immigrant Karl Heinmiller in 1957, along with Alaska Indian Arts, Inc., a carving and regalia-making program that evolved into a workshop and co-op. In 1960, Heinmiller acquired funding from the Bureau of Indian Affairs for skills training and employment programs based in the revival of Indigenous craft skills and carving traditions. Heinmiller hired and supported a number of local Haines and Alaska Native artists. Thus, while Jackson danced with the Chilkat Dancers, he also continued to develop his carving techniques at AIA, exploring different mediums and larger scales under the influence of experienced carvers he met there, such as Wesley Willard, Edwin Casco, and Leo Jacobs, the latter of whom Jackson remembers translating large crest poles into miniature carvings. Alaska Indian Arts sent numerous delegations of dancers and carvers to conduct demonstrations at World's Fairs and expositions around the country, including the 1962 Century 21 exposition in Seattle. Jackson did not go to Seattle, but he did join Heinmiller and the dance group on their Las Vegas tour following the fair, where the Chilkat Dancers performed at a travelers convention. Following this performance, Jackson accompanied Heinmiller on a side trip to Santa Fe to visit the Institute of American Indian Arts, where some students from Haines were already enrolled in the Institute's opening class. Heinmiller encouraged Jackson to bring some of his paintings to show the administration there. Upon seeing the paintings, the school immediately offered him admission, and having just begun its first semester in October 1962, Jackson joined up. He would spend the next 2 years enrolled in Santa Fe. The Institute of American Indian Arts was founded as a national institution for the fine arts training of Indigenous youth in the United States. It fostered a modernist vision for what would become known as the New Indian Art Movement, in which Indigenous artists use contemporary idioms and techniques in combination with traditional forms and sources to move beyond stereotypical subject matter and outsider expectations, often based in essentialized notions of the past. At the Institute's founding, art director Lloyd Kivanu emphatically stated that, quote, "the future of Indian art lies in the future, not in the past," end quote, and he pushed his students to draw on their own traditions, for innovation and to evolve new contemporary art forms. Kivanu saw art as a site of creative expression that could aid the Indigenous youth in finding their personal identity in a rapidly changing and modernizing world, and he would encourage his students to draw on their heritage and, quote, "cultural difference as a basis for creative expression." From its inception, the Institute emphasized modern forms and techniques such as abstraction, expressionist figuration, and mixed media assemblage, in combination with a basis in traditional cultural forms from the communities and backgrounds of its students. Jackson found this modernist ideology in full force when he joined the school, as well as found numerous departments to explore, including sculpture, ceramics, painting, and graphic arts. Unlike the emphasis on Indigenous carving traditions at the Alaska Indian Arts, Inc., New's philosophy encouraged using traditional arts as a basis for the exploration of new forms. Jackson attempted to participate in the ceramic studio and the sculpture studio, the latter run by the famed Apache sculptor Alan Hauser, but the marble and clay dust agitated his lungs. Instead, Jackson focused on painting classes and the silkscreen studio. He expanded on and refined his portrait work, producing paintings like this watercolor, Tlingit Dancer, a 1963 depiction of a figure in ceremonial regalia, not so dissimilar from those worn by his Chilkat dancers troupe. Unlike those static bust portraits, this full-length dancer is depicted in dynamic movement, arms and knees bent, the tassels of the Chilkat dance apron and ermine fur trim of the frontlet flowing with his movements. Now, Jackson was a keen observer of trends and commercial interests, and he learned certain techniques from the surrounding art trade of Santa Fe. He witnessed a painter selling portraits of native children to tourists that were executed in oil on luscious stretched velvet surfaces, which is what inspired him to adopt the medium for his own portraits of Tlingit elders on velveteen. He first began selling those paintings in Haines for extra income during summers back home from the Institute. He also adopted the palette and subject matter of Santa Fe. This portrait, titled Old Navajo Lady from 1963, is another bust-length portrait of an elder, but this time a Diné or Navajo woman rather than a Tlingit chief. Jackson has depicted her in the burnt reddish-brown and orange tones typical of Southwest imagery, with special attention to the crevices and shadows of her aged face. But unlike his velveteen portraits, Jackson made liberal use of impasto techniques in this painting, namely in the woman's turquoise necklace, which stands out in bright and very thickly applied brushstrokes. The background is also not black or neutral, but this fiery mix of red and yellow that stands out in its thick and expressionistic brushwork. As a student in the silkscreen studio at the Institute, Jackson gained his first experience with modern commercial studio design. Lloyd New offered a textile print course to teach his students design principles and processes that were the basis of his successful Scottsdale-based business, Kiva Studio. New encouraged the use of vibrant colors and the creative deployment of indigenous design elements toward a modern design aesthetic. He encouraged his textile students to combine elements from their own heritage with contemporary printing techniques and modish variations in color and texture. The resulting designs used indigenous motifs in unconventional arrangements and colors printed in varied lengths on materials such as cotton, linen, and canvas. In his textile shop, Jackson likewise followed the director's methodologies and produced textile designs based on Tlingit forms, a number of which remain in the Institute's collection, such as this textile with eagle designs. These textiles feature designs that derive from formline figures, often printed on fabrics that exhibit Lloyd New's favorite color clash dyeing techniques, which combine multiple curving registers of sometimes incongruous tones within the fabric. New was interested in traditional motifs from different Native American cultures and contexts, including an apparent interest in Northwest Coast regalia, as evidenced by this dress and hat that, clearly inspired by spruce root hats, was produced in the late 1950s. It's thus unsurprising that he encouraged Jackson and other students from Alaska and the Northwest Coast to experiment with imagery derived from the formline tradition, which translated particularly well to graphic design work. Alaskan peers of Jackson, for example, these Athabascan artists Bill Blackmore and Charles Tiga, also created formline-derived textile designs while with Lloyd Kiva New in his classes. Jackson's teachers found his work to be particularly successful, and it was included in this March 1964 issue of Interior Design magazine. In an article titled New Horizons for the American Indian, a spread introduced the enlightened programming of the Institute and its goal of tapping into, quote, the great reservoir of talent inherent in the centuries-old Indian culture, end quote. The works depicted in the piece are winners of the 5 cash prizes awarded by the magazine to Institute students who were doing the most creative work in ceramics, sculpture, painting, textiles, and metal arts, as selected by the faculty of the Institute. Jackson shared the textile award with another student for his design, Tlingit Textile Design in Blue, here illustrated. The design, a single-clawed bear figure flanked by abstract shapes emulating the U-forms and ovoids of formline design, draws upon Tlingit visual traditions that Jackson had not quite refined at this time. But it also subjects the formline design to a strict repetition within a decorative grid, presented in the magazine as an appealing curtain of fabric or a choice for the avant-garde designer. Jackson would later recall that Kiva New stressed to him that, quote, the important thing in design work is the background, end quote, and the planning of a layout. The close interplay of complementary silkscreen image and fabric negative in Jackson's design demonstrates how even a take on formline that he would later characterize in his own words as naive could translate well to the modern ambitions of New's textile studio. The design was reproduced at least 3 times in different color combinations, and Jackson's textile is among the first appearances of contemporary Northwest Coast design in such a high-profile American publication or magazine, though it is not the first silkscreen textile to be produced by a Northwest Coast artist. In his posthumously published memoir, Lloyd Kivanup described the Institute as a place whose, quote, freedom approach encouraged students to express themselves in relationship to the changes taking place in an evolving society, end quote. Jackson's experiments in new contemporary art forms can best be seen in the series of prints he produced in 1963 in the class of Seymour Tubis, the graphic arts and painting instructor at the Institute. Titled Kushta, or Land Otter, in Tlingit, though perhaps Kushta Ka, or Land Otter Man, would be more accurate, the print depicts a series of masks and figures executed in a fairly rough formline style, heavy black line printed against a background of varied color and black wood grain. Several versions of the woodcut were produced, notably this version produced with blue color fields, ovoids, and trigons, printed on a lavender, fuchsia, and orange graded background, very reminiscent of Lloyd Kivanup's color clash textile technique. The blue fills the space in the face of the mask figure in profile in the top center, as well as on the face and grimacing teeth of this black ursine mask in the bottom left. They're connected by seemingly ambiguous black lines that run from face into hair and back and forth, and blue tail-like elongated split U-forms seem to frame the upper mask, and also blue is used to bedeck this sitting figure in clothing as well as a hat. A blue claw mirrors a black claw on the bottom, and a salmon trout head fills this inner ovoid joint, though it's not totally clear which of these features belong to any particular body. Another version of the print was produced in 1964 without these blue tertiary forms. Instead, Jackson opted for abstract blobs and circular fields of red, green, orange, and purple gestural strokes that produced this kind of centripetal force beneath the black lines of the woodcut. An edition of Kushta, likely this blue one here, was submitted to the 1964 Scottsdale National Indian Exhibition, where it won Best of Show, a major coup and cash prize for the young artist. Now, Seymour Tubis encouraged Jackson to submit that print to the competition and closely assisted Jackson in the class where it was made, doing apparently the framing and the matting for the print. Jackson recalls how Tubis invited students over to see his house and show them his own work, these large abstract paintings as big as a wall, according to Jackson, that looked to him like he had thrown a bunch of paint on the canvas. Nathan's words. Such abstract work encouraged Jackson to explore vibrant and non-representational color and likely influenced the bright palette of figurative works such as Old Navajo Lady. As the instructor of printmaking, painting, and design, Tubis was singly in charge of establishing the printmaking department. His teaching practice was very much in line with Lloyd New's philosophy to make something modern out of the traditional, and he encouraged expressions and experimentation that allowed students to reflect on their roots and personal idioms, especially those allied to some of their traditional crafts and materials, as he wrote later, yet explored through modern methods. In choosing materials like feathers and bark for his students to work with as print materials within the graphic art studio, there was also a notion of a romanticized and essentialized traditional craft, something that is pre-industrial in Tubis's mind. Indeed, Tubis was no stranger to a kind of primitivist tendency in the mid-century American world of painting. He studied at the Art Students League from 1946 to 1949 in New York, as well as with the abstract expressionist painter Hans Hofmann in 1951. Tubis was a student of and later assistant instructor for Will Barnett, an abstract painter who, along with Steve Wheeler, Peter Busa, and Robert Burrell, was one of the key figures of a movement known as the Indian Space Painting Movement. The Indian Space Painters grew out of the Art Students League in New York in the 1940s and based their abstract and semi-abstract work on Native American art. They were drawn to the forms of Northwest Coast art in particular, and in 1946, the same year that Seymour Tubis started at the Art Students League, a group of Indian space painters hosted their exhibition, Semiology, or 8 and a Totem Pole. Their journal Iconograph reproduced their paintings alongside Native American art, especially Northwest Coast art, as well as language, symbols, and folktales. The premise of that exhibition and Indian space painting in general was defined in Iconograph as, quote, painting a new magic out of old star-driven symbols rooted in an understanding of American Indian art, using it, not historically, but as a competent vehicle for current representational art, end quote. Their paintings tended to favor all-over composition, two-dimensional abstract design, and expressionist coloration, and they were exhibited in that exhibition alongside a small Haida house post. Will Barnett did not exhibit in that show, but as a teacher of Tubis, and in his own work, he emphasized the spatial structures of Northwest Coast art, specifically the abstraction of form, the flattening of space, and the ambiguous relationship between positive and negative space characteristic of form-line design. Inspired by the carved bentwood boxes and crest poles in nearby museum collections, Will Barnett told his Art Students League students that there was, quote, a strength in the decisive ways that they, the Northwest Coast Indigenous peoples, arranged objects so that there was not only a dynamic movement, but a tremendous balance between forces, a sort of equilibrium. They had no negatives in their two-dimensional space, they had all positives, end quote. As a pedagogical strategy, Barnett took his classes to New York museums like the American Museum of Natural History and Gustav Hayes Museum of the American Indian in order to show his students firsthand these features and the, quote, tension-laden relationships that he saw manifest in the objects from such historic collections. In works produced in the late 1940s, when Tubis worked as his assistant, Barnett incorporated these aesthetic principles into his own work. Scholars such as Ann Gibson and Jackson Rushing have pointed out that Northwest Coast forms influenced Barnett's oeuvre for much of his career. The biomorphic forms contained within rectangular planes, compartments, and works such as Summer Family of 1948 here are clearly indebted to Northwest Coast crest poles or house posts. Fields of positive space, vertically organized flat shapes, and X-ray imagery in works like his self-portrait of 1953 and the 4th of July of 1954 demonstrate how Barnett used Northwest Coast forms and structures in order to emulate the, quote, metamorphic power of tribal art that the Indian space painters considered to be the central theme of Northwest Coast culture. Barnett and his theories and his teachings influenced Tubis. The former being a student and assistant, or the former being a teacher of Tubis, and Tubis being his assistant instructor. Tubis attended class museum visits to see Northwest Coast art with Barnett, and having studied at the Art Student League at the height of Indian space painting, Tubis could not have avoided their prominent exhibitions and publications at the school. His own oeuvre moved past Cubist explorations in his early career and mirrored the Indian space painters in their desire to surpass Cubism through Native American art and forms. His own work would deeply reflect Barnett's lessons, such as in this 1948 etching, Space Objects, where organic, ovoid-like forms float in a flattened and fairly ambiguously defined space. Curving lines compartmentalize the space, and pictographic shapes and figures float freely amongst them. Tubis studied bold palettes and high-key colors with Hans Hofmann, and these bright colors consistently appear in his abstract practice. And primitivist inspiration remained a feature of his later work, as in the geometric figures of this woodcut Pueblo ceremonial trio that recalls Kachina dolls and wall paintings and ceremonial altars found in Pueblo kivas. The aesthetic principles that Barnett and Tubis had themselves derived in part from Northwest Coast art were thus taught back to Nathan Jackson at the Institute by Tubis. Formal comparison would suggest as much. On the one hand, the treatment of space in Jackson's Kushta, filled with all-over form and pattern and using unassociative colors and abstract shapes, shares an interest with the Indian space painters in the arrangement of geometric motifs in a vertically oriented design, within and in relation to defined linear structures. The pictographic figures floating in Kushta, in this bottom corner, certainly seem to be related to those floating throughout Seymour Tubis's work. Black outlines flow between the masks, and the blue tertiary forms follow the curves and outlines of the primary lines that derives from the spatial principles of Northwest Coast art that Tubis encouraged and taught back to his students, in this case taught back to someone from the Northwest Coast. In Kushta, there is evidence of a genealogy from the abstract and primitivist principles of the Indian space painters, themselves inspired by Northwest Coast art, and passed from Barnett to Tubis before back to Jackson, who used those principles with his own knowledge of form-line design from his own upbringing to produce a fairly distinctive brand of modern Northwest Coast art. At the urgings of his teachers at the Institute, Jackson continued to draw on Tlingit forms, those he knew but had not quite mastered. Although he had an idea of formline design, it was New's encouragement to take up his heritage and to, quote, study it, revere it, copy it, preserve it, adapt it, end quote, for his own needs that pushed Jackson to begin to explore 19th century Northwest Coast forms even more. The library at the Institute had an invaluable collection of illustrated publications on Northwest Coast art and allowed Jackson to study classic designs. This untitled black and red woodblock print made in 1964 at the Institute seemed clearly based on bentwood box designs, though translated into a more open and loose internal composition. Jackson has said when he was making this work that he, quote, didn't really understand or know much about Northwest Coast art at this point, and that he was, quote, just trying it out, end quote. The departures from a typical box design, this kind of red tongue hanging out, lots of empty space on the edges, demonstrate that he was really self-teaching an approach to these forms at this time. But his attempt to replicate the principles of such a design in an original composition show that Jackson was emulating, if not strictly adhering to, what would later be canonized in the grammar of formline. In the summer of 1964, Jackson left the Institute and traveled to New York to join the Alaska Indian Arts team at the World's Fair as part of the Alaska Pavilion, a carving crew that included Tlingit artists Leo Jacobs, Peter C. Johnson Sr., Tommy Jimmy Sr., and Wesley Willard, who were conducting carving demonstrations in New York City and working on crest poles throughout the summer. Jackson worked on the large poles as an assistant carver, but he also brought his two-dimensional practice to New York with him. He set up a small studio in the back room of the house he was sharing with the other Alaskan artists, and while carving as an artist during the day for the crowds of the World's Fair, he would paint and print make at night, somewhat to the disdain of the other carvers, apparently. The duality of Jackson's artistic practice seemed representative of the tension between a fine art practice and category on the one hand, and the performance of traditional or carving displays of ethnicity on the other. A visitor to the Alaska Pavilion in this letter to the editor of the Tundra Times, in fact, complained about the low quality of the Alaska exhibition, and especially its more ethnographic features. Yet she also commented on what she saw as the highlight of the exhibition. Quote, one bright spot in the Alaska exhibit was the most neglected, a young Indian sitting beside one of the totem poles. I learned that he was a Tlingit from Haines, a talented young artist who had won scholarships and awards for his fine work that he has done in many fields, including textiles, using as inspiration the handsome art forms of his ancestors. Why were not some of his cultural achievements on display? This young Indian, quote, from Haines, who won multiple awards and worked in textiles, of course, was Nathan Jackson. Jackson recalls spending a lot of time at the Museum of Natural History when in New York, where he found many of the great treasures of 19th century Northwest Coast art. He returned repeatedly to that collection, looking closely at it, absorbing it, refining his understanding of Tlingit forms and objects that he'd otherwise only been able to see in books at the Institute. After the World's Fair, he returned to Santa Fe, but did not go back to school, believing he had learned quite enough. Carl Heinmiller paid for his return journey to Haines and hired him at the Alaska Indian Arts as an instructor. There, he put his experience at the Institute to use as a silkscreen and printing instructor. This photo of Jackson working and teaching at Alaska Indian Arts shows that he styled himself after his former instructors, wearing a shirt, a tie, an artist's smock, maintaining the air of an arts professional. This kind of act of modernist self-fashioning did not go unnoticed by the other carvers at the co-op, who jokingly would refer to him as the professor or doctor. From 1965 to 67, Jackson taught screen printing at the Alaska Indian Arts and used the lessons of Lloyd Kiva-New to train new Alaska Indian Arts artists and trainees in textile design. He ran several printing workshops in Haines, funded by the Manpower Development Training Act program, a federal program intended to retrain workers displaced by technological change, using whatever materials available, including linoleum blocks stripped from the bases of fishing boat floors. Jackson taught the principles of block printing to a younger generation of male and female trainees who, it seems, took up many of his lessons in earnest. Few of them, though, are known to have pursued artistic careers. In this 1966 special issue of Smoke Signals, some of the prints from the workshop are reproduced, including a 1965 print here by the Tlingit trainee Phoebe Hammond, titled Frog. The print depicts a simple split-form frog design in black on a green background, with a few ovoid joints and kind of rib-like hashes under its sides. The background has this kind of simulated wood grain or likely leftover texture from the carving process, a technique that Jackson also used in his Santa Fe prints. And other students included the likes of Pete Johnson, Henry Kadek, James Ward, and Dan Morrison, who all produced these prints in Jackson's workshop. Jackson clearly incorporated his aesthetic from the Institute into his teaching in Alaska, and it lingered in his own work. This photo captures him pulling a print that he made in the same 1965 May workshop, one titled Fire Mask. It's downstairs today. This print depicts a deeply shadowed and bearded mask in bright red and black, apparently based on a Tlingit shaman's mask that Jackson saw in a museum. It's modeled and representational, far more than the very flat and reduced form line designs in Kushta. And there's a very special attention to kind of the rounded volume of the face and the painted markings derived from presumably the real-world example. Its three-quarter view and expressive features suggest a portrait as much as a copy, recalling the oil portraits that he made in paint, still was making at this time. And like his earlier prints, Fire Mask floats just above an abstract, fiery black and red space. The background is filled with these wavering lines etched into a flat black wash from which the mask seems to emerge, surrounded by a halo of fiery red tendrils that resemble a wood grain texture or flickering flames or some other kind of abstract space. This push and pull of depth in the print as the mask pushes its way forward seems rather ambiguous, recalling some of the lessons that the Indian space painters appreciated about Indian space. With its vibrant use of color, abstract textured ground, and figurative rather than stylized representation, Fire Mask seems to be a synthesis of different aspects of Jackson's modernist training. This method of adaptation and copying from real-world examples was prevalent in Jackson's workshop and at Alaska Indian arts in general. Carl Heinmiller encouraged artists to copy designs from images of Northwest Coast art reproduced in publications by Franz Boas and Robert Bruce in Verity, which were some of the most richly illustrated examples available in the day. This print titled Dragonfly by John Nelson, for example, was copied from a Haida argillite platter reproduced in Bruce and Verity's book Art of the Northwest Coast. Another print by Welch Mathlaw, made in Jackson's workshop, is also a copy. A print of a ceremonial copper combines the upper and lower halves of real-life Tina from the Smithsonian Institution and the British Museum that were also illustrated in Bruce and Verity's book. These prints are two of several that are in the collection of the Autry Museum in Los Angeles. And I don't have time today to go too into depth on this story of how prints got from Haines, Alaska to Los Angeles. I can briefly tell you that in 1965, Carl Heinmiller, always looking for more funding, managed to have a technical assistance study commissioned by the Department of Commerce in order to determine the economic and technical feasibility of establishing a light arts and crafts industry in Haines. As part of the study, the consulting company Ernst & Ernst brought examples of arts and crafts products from Alaska to Los Angeles and New York City gift shows, where they tested the market for such products. 23 different prints produced in Jackson's workshop ended up being brought to these shows, including 6 prints by Jackson himself. And I think that in 1965, this was probably one of the greatest exhibitions of Northwest Coast native prints of its time. Apparently, prints by Nathan were extremely successful at these trade shows. Buyers in LA and New York garnered or bought them for the highest prices of any of the prints, and the Ernst & Ernst consulting report says that prints like these have a definite future and demonstrate major demand for a potentially lucrative market for prints produced in Haines. Also, in 1966, Jackson traveled to the Los Angeles County Fair with Alaska Indian Arts, and no doubt buoyed by this earlier success, Carl had many of his artists bring plenty of products, including prints, to the county fair, where they were sold. A series of prints in the Autry collection in LA probably came from the county fair and illustrate Nathan's transition to a more classic style at this time. They depict familiar subjects in classic form lines such as eagle or whale, and we can see they gradually move away from that kind of color clash technique that he had picked up in Santa Fe towards a more standard palette of red, black, and white. Unique to some of these prints, which may be difficult to see, is that Nathan has signed them in his Tlingit name, Yechedi. Such an assertion of Tlingit language at this early moment in 1965 to 1966 seems to go hand in hand with his turn towards a more classic Tlingit style. The raven here is a configurative profile, but unlike works that were printed earlier by Nathan, is moved fully into the traditional palette of red and black on this white background. This transition to classic style had been percolating since his return to Haines. Following his largely self-taught investigations in Santa Fe, Jackson's understanding of form line and carving practices was substantially bolstered when he met Bill Holm in Haines. Holm was in the final stages of his analysis of two-dimensional Northwest Coast form and the vocabulary of its stylistic elements that would be published as Northwest Coast Indian Art, an Analysis of Form in 1965, when he met Nathan in Haines. Carl Handmiller had contracted Bill Holm to give several days of instruction during the MDTA program in 1965, the same time Jackson was giving his print workshops. Upon hearing Holm's lecture, Jackson found what he described as a shortcut to understanding form lines conventions. He recalled that, quote, "When I found Bill's book, I was amazed because it was all laid out right there," end quote. In 1967, the money started to run up at Alaska Indian Arts, and Jackson left to work independently. He opened a gallery in Haines called the Raven's Wing Art Studio and continued creating contemporary paintings for locals in addition to his jewelry and portrait business. He called it rather unusual stuff, and he won another prize in contemporary art painting in the 1967 Haines Art Show. But by the end of the 60s, Jackson had dedicated more and more of his practice to developing and honing his understanding of a classic Tlingit style, exchanging those modernist experiments at the Institute of American Indian Arts for the form line principles that would be emphasized during the so-called Renaissance period. The invitation to submit to the Arts of the Raven exhibition in 1967, a connection through Bill Holm actually, probably gave Jackson some encouragement to double down on the pursuit of classic forms, despite what would become a rejection, especially because at this moment, the styles and forms that he brought from Santa Fe were not proving to be viable for commercial success in the Alaskan context, at least. Local business could not support his studio, and in 1969, Raven's Wing closed. He continued to work independently, traveling around the state, repairing crest poles, teaching workshops, and honing his carving practice. In 1971, the Alaska State Museum invited him for a joint exhibition with Kwakwaka'wakw carver Tony Hunt. And the works produced to advertise this exhibition, such as this poster, the exhibition titled Northwest Coast Carvers, Tony Hunt and Nathan Jackson, demonstrate how Jackson had really moved this time through his print practice into a more classic style. The poster includes this box form motif, which Jackson and many artists emulated from the cover of Holmes' An Analysis of Form. Other prints like this configurative whale design produced the following year likewise display much more interior complexity than those whale prints from 1966. The basic ovoid building blocks in the earlier pieces are replaced here by a variety of faces, forms, beaks, and asymmetrical elements that are much bolder and more playful in his explorations. So how did the early education and experiments inform the rest of Nathan's career? To conclude, I'd like to propose that in Nathan's first large-scale commissions, we can see precisely where some of that modernist printing and painting practice undergirds the rest of his long and successful career. His first monumental commissions, such as the 1973 carved and painted house screen for the Ketchikan International Airport, that was then followed by a carved and painted house screen for the Peabody Museum in Harvard, show what seem at first to be a fairly cemented rejection of some of those modernist styles that he took out of Santa Fe in favor of a refined classic Tlingit style. Such work, Jackson would later say, referring to these panels, was trying to, quote, maintain the traditional Tlingit style in a way that felt to him like that of a, quote, trailblazer who has looked over an old trail covered with brush that needed to be cleared away so the trail could be reestablished. At the time of his Peabody House Screen Commission, which Rosita Worrell was presiding over, Nathan, however, considered his work to be a, quote, blending of real contemporary form and traditional form, contemporary with the adaptation of traditional style. In the film documenting his completion of this house screen, the footage of which is downstairs in the lobby, and includes Jackson's careful drawing and designing and painting, I think we can see how central draftsmanship is to the practice of Nathan Jackson. He handles his paintbrush very carefully, he runs it over the spatial delineations drawn onto the panel's surface, and he uses long, smooth single strokes that demonstrate a long experience in painting and drawing technique. The influence of his Santa Fe training seems to be present here in these painterly marks, and in his technique of drawing the layout of the design, especially with the large stencils he used to maintain the regularity of his geometric motifs. The stencils, as a kind of mechanically reproductive form, echo the silkscreen mechanical reproduction that he learned in the printmaking process. On the house screen here, Jackson supplements the reproduced geometric forms of his stenciled ovoids with hand-painted color, not unlike the expressive additions of color that he added to the different editions of his prints. Jackson would later say that drawing, quote, "at least for me, is pretty important to come up with a likeness of any Indian art pieces. You have to see what you're looking at, and you have to be able to critique your own work," end quote. Draftsmanship and the act of critically looking is intrinsic to Jackson's carving practice, as is a kind of mechanical reproduction. Jackson's formative years of fine arts education, especially his lessons in graphic design and spatial layout with Lloyd Kivanu, with Seymour Tubis, are foundational to his work and career. Throughout the subsequent decades, as Jackson took on apprentices and passed on knowledge of his Tlingit style, his pedagogy would always begin with teaching them how to draw, just as one part of his own career began learning to draw with charcoal back at Mount Edgecombe Hospital. Thank you. Gunolchish. And I have even more to show, but I'll leave it there and happy to take questions or any comments. Yeah, thank you.
We spent some time in Haiti where they do a lot of velvet, painting on velvet. Is
Uh-huh.
there any crossover or connection between that work there and his choice to paint on velvet in the early pieces here?
I don't know anything about the use of velvet in Haiti, but velvet, especially in the 60s and 70s, was known as this kitsch medium that portraits of Elvis would be painted on, portraits of celebrities. You can still buy that stuff in Hollywood. There's lots of kitsch velvet painting. And it was kind of a luscious material that made a really nice object for and relatively, compared to canvas, cheap material to be produced on. So it's very popular with a variety of tourist and curio trades. And it's been written about really as kitsch, but I think when Nathan uses it, it does something else entirely. Especially the shadowy background, its soft texture really creates an ambiance that evokes those kind of Edward Curtis studio photographs. And I think it really demonstrates a complexity to Nathan's thinking around this kind of system of visual production that happened to also be quite popular with people interested in nice-looking, luscious velvet paintings.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm kind of shocked that he was able to support himself in a town like as small as Queens in
Uh-huh.
the 60s. That's just amazing.
I agree. And the extent to which even Alaska Indian Arts was able to support itself without federal funding is questionable. I mean, Nathan was primarily supported through Alaska Indian Arts when he was in Haines. When he tried to get off on his own, he ended up not being able to make it just through the Haines market and had to start going further abroad with carving classes, workshops. He was getting commissions around the state. So he became much more itinerant, especially after 69, which is also when he started getting some of his bigger commissions, which ended up being the real primary support before he ended up with the wonderful carving shed permanently down in Saxman.
Like, how were tourists getting into Haines and out of Haines at that time?
Yeah, good.
Before the ferries.
Yeah, I think it was a much more limited tourist market.
Travelers.
Independent travelers. I don't have any stats on how many visitors were getting to Haines every year, but certainly could not have been that many, you'd think. But probably similarly by boat. There were still lots of folks before the cruise ship started, so lots of ferry traffic and lots of boat traffic that was still wandering up the Alaska Seaway. So there was a thriving trade, for 100 plus years, and Nathan was tapping into some small part of it. Chuck, yeah.
So it was fun to see those images there of Nathan drawing on paper and using cutouts on paper. He still does that today. Is that something he learned somewhere, or was that something that he invented?
I'm not sure. I haven't asked him when he began the stenciling, because stenciling, of course, is a historic technique that many artists through pre-contact and into contact periods on the Northwest Coast used to have uniform form line design forms. So we have plenty of examples of wooden stencils of ovoids that were in kind of artist kits. And I don't know where Nathan picked it up. I haven't asked him. He might have seen, I think there's one of those kits in the Natural History Museum in New York. He might have seen stencils there, or I think it was also part of his silkscreen training. He knew that to get these symmetrical designs, he needed something to help balance his compositions, whether it was a textile for Lloyd Kivanu or coming onto a large monumental commission or house panel. So I really think that he brought a lot of that training from Santa Fe on paper or on textiles, on silkscreen, to this kind of understanding. And I think what you're suggesting is that maybe some of the stenciling, which happened to be a very iconic Tlingit art making tool, also came through some of that modern art training that he received.
The ladies were also, I mean, they were using that to make moccasin tops.
Mm-hmm.
We have collections, there are collections of patterns from ladies that were making moccasins.
Yeah.
So I'm giving credit to the women.
Yes.
I think that's very fair. Any other questions? Also, other fun works by Nathan that I did not get into, but some of the works downstairs are from the Anchorage Museum, and one part of Nathan's transition to, I think, a more classic style is that he started winning prizes for it, especially at the Alaska, or the Festival of Alaska Native Arts, as well as festivals down south, like the Philbrook Indian Invitational Annual. He made this box in 1965 and won a prize for 1967, got a purchase award, started getting cash prizes. This dish he won a cash prize for. And this photo of the print he was doing in 1965, if you compare the design done in the same year, he clearly is working both in 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions and translating both of those styles to one or the other. Using this textile would actually become a shirt that he would wear, but also present on this kind of bentwood box form. He demonstrated a clear proficiency with being able to move between the 3-dimensional, the 2-dimensional, being able to translate Tlingit classic forms amongst more modern or more traditional styles. I mean, they kind of cohabit at the same time. And this mask, which is downstairs as well, he won another Best in Show prize for. And I just couldn't help but think of this comparison. He's making these prints before he starts carving some of these masks. And he happens to win the prize for the mask. He'd won earlier prizes for prints, but he's in Alaska getting a lot more attention for his carving practice from these kinds of festivals, which themselves have a certain kind of expectation for what should be winning or not. And Nathan always knew certainly where the wind was blowing, what could be the most successful. And it also related to the practice he was carving for his community, for at home. And it just ended up being what he dedicated his life to, was this pursuit of Tlingit form in the classic style. And there's some relation, I think, to what his son, Stephen Jackson, has been doing in recent years. And there's a lot of young Nathan in his son in this exploration of what formline could have been or was. And he said that certainly the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe in the 1960s would have loved what Stephen's doing today. And having this juxtaposition at the Burke Museum really shows what the difference is in their practices today, but you also can't help but think back to that Kushta print and the way it's expanded across the paper, the way it fills up the entire limits of the print, and the ways that Stephen on the right has really expanded what formline can be, and see some of his father in that experimental post as well, or at least I would say. Yeah.
I'd like to see the Kushta print again.
Yeah.
Because there's parts
Happily.
of it that I'm not quite getting, and I'm assuming that you've studied it a lot. I'm just wondering what your idea of what was going on. It's
Let's get a big one.
okay.
Do you like blue or red more?
Oh, that was good. You know what? Until now, I didn't see that reclining figure. I couldn't figure out what
It took me a long time to see a lot of these different elements. So this is the reclining figure here, kind of sideways. The black body is then covered with a blue, might be a blue, blue robe, blue nahin, a blue crest hat with potlatch
Ah,
basketry rings kind of coming off of it. This is the main mask. And, in the print process, Nathan had this brightly colored ground that he then put the primary linear design into black on top of. And then he had to go through many artist proofs to get the outline for the blue colors to line up properly. So there are lots of artist proofs where they're really off-centered, or he has trouble getting them to match up with the forms. And he was clearly thinking about this in similar kind of ways to primary and secondary and tertiary form line, in the way the color fills the negative space, but then also becomes positive and becomes its own form or overlaid. So you can't really say that the blue is just a tertiary form. It's doing many more kinds of things. It's outlining, but also filling in, but then also behind as an independent kind of ovoid eye form. Then also this claw is mirroring this other claw. Are they two claws? Are they a shadow of a claw? It's ambiguous. It's not meant to be completely digestible or comprehensible. And that's part of kind of the radicality of experiments like this that fit in very well with a modernist tendency that's being taught in Santa Fe. But then that also are looking towards known Tlingit forms that he, of course, knew from his upbringing, that he had seen, and kind of the title Kushta has puzzled me. I would love any other suggestions other than kind of the reference to land otter, because I'm not really sure, where is this a one single land otter? Land otter man is a state of transformation, because some of that kind of transformative ambiguity is such a characteristic of Tlingit forms. I think we can also say it's certainly present here. Figure or multiple figures in a kind of state of transformation in a very cosmological or mythical way, but being done by Nathan in this highly modernist context and drawing on imagery and subject matter that people like the Indian space painters were losing their minds over. These New York painters loved this kind of stuff. And Nathan's about 15 years later, but he would have fit in very well with them as someone moving through these styles and these this kind of imagery that drove the avant-garde wild.
I was actually wondering if this was inspired by some incidents in Haines, where we had stories of an individual who became a Kushta or could transform themselves into different individuals. And Kushta could transform themselves into multiple individuals depending on who they encountered.
Right.
So that was what I was wondering. But I see the two human figures there, and so that puzzles me.
Well, yeah, this figure seems to be in a real state of change. I totally agree, Rosita. The nature of the Kushta as that figure moving between water and land, moving between different planes of existence. And there's something about prints that are transformative themselves. You go from this wet medium that you just roll it and suddenly the image appears. It's a pretty magical process, printmaking in general. Much less process-oriented than a large painting, for example. Because once you make the design, you don't really know what comes out till you pull it. And once you pull it, it just appears. So there is something, I think, very relevant between the imagery and the subject matter and the process that Nathan's drawing on. Mike, yeah.
It's interesting that he learned a bit of, and took his Santa Fe learnings up to Haines, where he was surrounded by elders. Because growing up in a village, we know elders that have contacted with Kushta. And like my little older brother, Lauren, had that experience. And the transformation of them, but also looking at them, they hypnotized you. But they shifted in shape and into different things. One of the things with growing up in a village, when you're hunting, the elders would look at where you're going and tell you what to look out for. There were sacred places such as the spiritual man burial you never went close to, but if you did, you felt it, and you still feel it today. Sick because of the power But I'm sure Nathan, being an artist, he took some of that imagery of warnings of what to look out for when you're out there by yourself. That the Kush, the Ottermen, are always looking at a way of saving you, especially when you fall into the water. They say when they disappear, the Kushta saved them in their turn and still maintain them. And that's what we see when you're out there by yourself. But there are ways to break that hypnotism, that power over you. There are certain ways of doing that. And I could just imagine, like, Danawak, old man up there, talking to his tribal brother, Nathan, or George Lewis, or Richard King, or the Hodge brothers of Klukwan. I'm sure they sat around drinking coffee or putting up traditional foods and telling them their experiences, but also letting Nathan know what to look out for.
Yeah, and what do you?
So that's really powerful.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. That's wonderfully said. And when you said hypnotism, it brought this version to mind, because that kind of swirl of the color in the center is almost, there's a hypnotic quality to it. And one of the things I wonder about work like this that Nathan did is it was done in this context in Santa Fe where folks did not know those stories. Probably very few people other than Nathan knew those stories at all, other than what might have been in some kind of anthropology books they might have had down there. And so when this kind of work wins a prize in an art show in Scottsdale, Arizona, you wonder what's winning the prize. And then what's Nathan not telling when he has this kind of imagery that he's using. And that history of refusing or not giving away the whole story in the kind of modern art context certainly seems to kind of be at play here. Because I don't even know, there were maybe 5 Tlingit students in Santa Fe at his time. And so maybe 5 people who knew what Kushto was, what the title meant. Maybe he told people, maybe not. I haven't asked him how many people would have known what it was. But there's something in that kind of hypnotism that is also not translatable to that modern art world down in Santa Fe, to all the tourists down there, to the people who are running the Southwest Scottsdale art show and giving him the prize. And there's kind of a mystery or mischief about that as well, in that kind of subject matter. Yeah, so thank you for your words.
Well, I want to thank Chris, for his great work. When I first read his article, I said, oh, doggone it, where was he when we were working on the Nathan Jackson exhibit? I'm so glad we found him. But his work really exemplifies, what we're trying to do at Sealaska Heritage Institute. That we've been talking about creating Juneau as the Northwest Coast Arts Capital, and we're trying to put it into practice. And one of the things that we are doing is that we have this partnership both with the University of Alaska Southeast, where we have put in money into developing the Northwest Coast Arts Program. And I wish that the faculty were here so that they could see what we really want to accomplish, with that program. But we also have a partnership with IAI, and I thought we were forging new paths, but we're actually copying what Nathan did, 40, 50 years ago. And so we're recreating, but kind of in reverse. What we're hoping is that our students here will get a good grounding in Northwest Coast art and then go on to Santa Fe and really be introduced to the world of creativity and art. But then students have a mind of their own, and some of them are going down to Santa Fe first. So we've had to rush down there and start teaching Northwest Coast art down there. But I'm really very inspired by your work. I think it's the kind of scholarship that we need to do more of it. I think, we've done there's been a lot of work, on our traditional arts, but not the exploration of different artists and their growth and, their development of their creativity. So I'm very excited by your work, and I'm hoping that we're going to be able to see much more of Chris. I know he's working on his dissertation. I don't want him to follow my path, taking 20 years to write a dissertation. So I'm going to try really hard not to bother him too much. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you. And if you want more, pick up a copy of Aboriginal, the Journal of Indigenous Studies, which has my article on Nathan in it. Not to be found on book stands, special order only. Thanks.